So now we are discuss about WH movement, and we are discuss about 2 points. The first one is WH construction and relative clauses. So the first thing I want to tell you that we see that every language have ways of moving clauses with moving phrase with the clauses, and we change the grammatical. So now I want to tell you the way of moving phrases with WH question, and it is usually called 5W plus 1H questions. So now I want to tell you that it is usually appear at the beginning of the words. So it's like what, who, where, which, when, why, and how. So what is asking about things, who asking about the person, where asking about place, which asking about an option or a choice, and when is asking about time, and why is asking for a reason, and how asking about a method. So now I want to give you example. So the example like this: Liz saw the gear with the long scarf at the bus yesterday. So the gear, we change it with YH construction, use the word who, like this: who did Liz see, and where did Liz see. And another example we may use: when did Liz see at the bus. So we should remember that every word that we use, it must be constituent, and every sentence that use it will be replaced being a question using WH construction.
I'm Elizabeth Tersimaimau. I will explain some further example of WH movement. The example you can see in the slide. Okay, the first one is WH movement to beginning of sentence prior to finite verb. The example shows statements and the related WH question with the underlined cap corresponding to the original precision of the moved expression. Note that in Welsh, the normal constituent order is verb, subject, object. That is, the finite verb or finite auxiliary is initial in the clause in a statement. You can see in the example, the finite element is in italics and the WH phrase is in bold type. The second WH movement landing site is a position immediately before the complementizer. The example you can see in this slide. From the example, there seems to be evidence from a variety of languages that the clause initial position to which the WH phrase move is actually the position immediately before the clause introducing element known as a complementizer. Of course, not all languages have complementizer or may not have them in all clause types, but many other languages do, and when this language also have WH movement to a clause initial position, then we can see that WH phrase comes immediately before the complementizer. Then that there may be a special clause initial position immediately preceding the complementizer position to which WH phrase are moved in language which, like English have WH movement. The third WH movement also applies in embedded clauses too. For example, you can see in the slide, the gap in 3A is the subject of the embedded clauses. The gap in 3B is the object of the embedded clause, and the gap in 3C is prepositional phrase adjunct to the verb. The major synthetic differences in English between embedded WH question and WH question in metric clauses is that subject or auxiliary inversion generally only applies in metric clauses.
Welcome to Syntax. My name is Edward and I'm from Group 7. What are the WH questions in English? In English, we have 5 very common WH questions. The first one is who. Who is the question to ask about subject, person, or people. For example, Edward left home at 8 this morning. The question is, who left home at 8 this morning? The second one is what. What is the question to ask about subject or object, thing, idea, and action? For example, they want money. The question is what they want. The next one is when. To ask about the time. For example, they are leaving for Kupang today. The question is, where are they leaving for Kupang? And the next one, where. Where is the question to ask about the place. For example, he is sitting in the corner. The question is, where is he sitting? Why? Why is the question to ask about the reason or purpose. Example, he left home when he was 18 to find a job. The question is, why did he leave home when he was 18? And the last one is how. To ask about manner, way, method of action. For example, how to make an omelette.
C2 is a WH element that has not been moved overtly. In some of language which Japan, Chinese, and French, all of WH element appear in situ. In language with overt movement of one of WH element like in English, the other WH elements stay in situ. For example, we can see in English language questionnaire question or specific question that asks for detailed specific information that the individual has encountered before.
I will explain about multiple WH question. In this final section on question, I illustrate the strategies which are employed when more than one constituent is questioned in single clause. As we know, English is a language with WH fronting. However, if more than one constituent is questioned, the only one the resulting WH expression can move to the clause, and remaining WH phrases must remain in should. For example, we can see here, Mark saw that stray dog last night. So the first one we must do it is we replace the word Mark with WH questions. So the mark is replaced with who, and that after saw, that we replace with word what. So the question is, who saw what last night. This is the way we use multiple questions.
Questions are show up when two WH words present in the same sentence. In English, they are formed by fronting one WH expression and leaving the others in situ. Multiple WH questions are important because they can provide evidence of there's two possibilities within a single language. One illustrates the strategies which are employed when more than one constituent is questioned in a single clause. For example, first, for A, Kim saw that stray dog last night. B, who saw what last night? And C, who what saw last night. In question B, we see the only grammatical option for asking a multiple WH question, while question C shows that if we attempt to front all of the WH fronting, then all the questioned phrases must appear in situ. Example number 2 for A. Where did the student study when? B. Where did the professor say the students studied when? And C. Where did the professor say when the students studied? Question A is single clause interrogative and questions B and C are declausal. Question B is ungrammatically multiple WH question. This question has two distinct readings. On one reading, where has moved from a first merged position in the embedded clause to the front of matrix clause for the matrix clause. On this reading, the question is a question about where the students studied and when they did so. On another reading, where is first merge in the matrix clause, and this question is interpreted as involving two separate questions. One about when the students studied, the other about where the professor was when he gave this information. Question C is graded in grammatically that where is interpreted as originating in the embedded clause. In this question, movement of where from the embedded clause to the specifier of the metric clause. And that's all. Example is if more than one constituent is questioned, then only one of the resulting WH expressions can move to the clause initial position, and the remaining WH phrases must remain in
Next, apart from using the WZ phrases in front of a sentence, we must also use constituent movements to focus on the phrases. And then, focus construction have a great deal in common with WZ fronting construction. Why is it that? Because they very often move the fronted phrases to a special clauses or initial position. Okay, the next material is about focus and other movement. Apart from fronting WH phrases, many languages also use movements of constituents. We're aiming in order to focus on particular phrases, perhaps in order to emphasize it, or else to in focus move to the initial position of the clause. Before we continue, the synthetic movement is the means by some theories of syntax address distinguished. Movement was first postulated by structuralist linguists who express in the terms of distinguished constituents of displacement.
Here are the examples of focus and movements based on the Diana's explanation before, and I will give you two examples of focus and movements, but in every example, there are two parts. The part A as the canonical sentence and the part B as the result of movements that indicates the focus. The first example is part A. John has told Peter that Mary likes the first story. Part B. What story has John told Peter that Mary likes? So here, the result of movements is what story, and the focus is the first story. What story in the first B sentence is the object of the transitive verb likes. So, by fronting the object as WH expression, it becomes the focus, and the focus here is the first story, while the movement is what story. The second example is part A. You think Fred loves Mary. Part B. Who do you think loves Mary? Here, the result of movements is who, and the focus is Fred, who loves Mary.
Okay, and I will explain about relative clauses. What is relative clauses? A relative clause is one kind of dependent clause. It has a subject and a verb, but cannot stand alone as a sentence. It functions like an adjective clause because it gives more information about a noun. Example of relative clauses. Relative clauses are clauses starting with the relative pronouns. They are most often used to define or identify the noun that precedes them. First example, do you know the girl who started in grade 7 last week? Second example, in the sentence, the dragon who breathed blue fire has retired. Who breathed blue fire is a relative clause. What are the types of relative clauses? There are two types of relative clauses. One type refers to a noun or a noun phrase, and the other type refers to a whole sentence or clause.
Why do we use relative clauses? A relative clause is a specific type of subordinate clause that adapts, describes, or modifies a noun. Relative clauses add information to sentences by using a relative pronoun such as who, that, or which. The relative clause is used to add information about noun so it will be related to the noun. How can we identify a relative clause? Recognize a relative clause when you find one. First, it will contain a subject and a verb. Next, it will begin with a relative pronoun like who, whom, was, that, or which, or a relative adverb like when, where, or why. Finally, it will function as an adjective, answering the questions what kind, how many, or which one.
Okay, today I want to explain for you what is cross-linguistic variation in relative clauses. And my friend Anita will give you example from cross-linguistic variation in relative clauses. Okay, Uh, Cross-linguistic variation in relative clauses. Although relative clauses construction in another language always contain a head noun and a restricting relative clause that modifies it. They don't necessarily share any of the other syntactic properties of English relative clauses. For instance, although relative clauses in European language commonly have a counterpart to their so-called relative pronouns who or which introducing the clause. One major typological distinction, a distinction in type, is in the order of the relative clause and the head noun. In English, the relative clause follows the head noun. For example, in the students who had read the book, the relative clause who had read the book follows the students. Just as in the English, this example from the Melanesian language, Tinrin has a gap in the direct object position within the relative clause. The object of the likes verb. The relative clause is not introduced by any relative pronouns or other special markers. In the Yimas language of Papua New Guinea, the verbal prefix "am" for relative marker function much like the W or Z word in that English. To mark the whole relative clause as a definite referred expression. However, that again, this is not a relative pronoun and does not come at the start of the relative clause. It's simply an affix of the verb.
I will explain about the example of the relative clause. In other language, the relative clause follows the head noun. In 43 and 44 are two examples from languages unrelated to English. I've braketed the relative clauses and the head nouns are shown in bold. SM in 43 stands for subject marker. For examples, in Tinrin language, in 43, you can see in the slide, 43 Wamye Randra Suvenharu Ratoni Ratrunomia. The woman there is three singular, like is subject marker. Tony is three singular, stay nomea. In English, the woman that Tony likes lives in nomea. Just as in the English, the example from the Melanesian language Tinrin has a gap in the direct object position within the relative clause. The object of the likes verb. The relative clause is not introduced by any relative pronouns or other special markers. And the second example in Yimas language, in 44, Ngikum irut nampan woman material with plus three plural. In English, the women who are weaving the mats. In the Yimas language of Papua New Guinea, the verbal prefix m until y glossed as rel for relative marker functions much like the W or Z word or that in English to mark the whole relative clause. To mark the whole relative clause as a definite referring expression. Note, however, that again this is not a relative pronoun and does not come at the start of the on the relative clause, it's simply an affix on the verb.
Several examples in Chapter 4 introduce the idea that nouns can take clauses as complement. The examples illustrate more noun complement clauses with those in. I'll illustrate relative clause. Each of these constructions is one kind of complex. In both sets of data, the head noun is modified by a clause, but there are distinct differences between the complement clauses and relative clause. There are four major syntactic differences between the two constructions. List as many of these as you can. Assuming the grammaticality judgments given, the star outside the parenthesis in means that the example is ungrammatical without the material inside the parenthesis. 1. The belief that which you state something obvious. 2. The Norton security that you were perceiving the earth to be flat. The hypothesis that the earth is flat. 2. The belief that which you state the Norton security that you were perceiving. The hypothesis that you heard yesterday.